Tell me if you've ever felt this before. You're an incredibly big fan of fantasy stories, not just for the world building and escapism it offers, but for the sense of wonder and mystery and intrigue its world provides. You watch tons of fantasy series with distinct yet similar premises. A world filled with magic, likely something medieval European with dragons, elves, dwarves, and evil demons. Or perhaps the writer has taken their magical fantasy to the modern day, offering a whole entire world of unseen magic just beneath the surface of our mundane lives. Or maybe it's a mesh of magic and sci-fi, where magic lies not only in the wondrous things it can do, but the wondrous technologies it can create, such as in Star Wars. But then there are the fantasy stories which do not impress. Ones which lack that sense of wonder you search so deeply for in a fantasy story. One which over-explains and over-justifies the place of magic in its world, where magic is less magic and more pseudoscience. In fact, it might not even be called magic in the first place. Jutsu, cursed energy, the force, ki, and on and on and on and on. Magic systems exist in more than just fantasy, and while they are not all comparable to one another, they are all also not created equally. For me personally, my favorite magic systems are the ones which achieve the perfect balance between explanation and mystery. Ones who are able to establish their fundamental principles while still leaving many questions for us to ponder. I think what makes or breaks a magic system in a story is the same thing that makes or breaks a good history or science class. Now, that's a weird statement, so let me expand on that before you click off of the video. Most of you watching are probably either still in school or freshly graduated, so I think you might already understand where I want to go with this. Growing up, I almost always had history teachers who could make the class incredibly fun and interesting. They emphasized the story in history, and instead of droning over countless dates and names and forcing us to memorize it, they instead turned those history lessons into stories. It's the same thing with science classes. I've had plenty of science teachers who are only concerned with having you memorize the information that's going to be on the test, endlessly doing worksheets in silence while they sit around and pretend to be available for answering questions. But then there are the science classes which make science fun. The types of classes with plenty of labs and hands-on experiments and entertaining demonstrations of the topics that we're covering. Bill Nye was able to teach us scientific facts and concepts by telling us a story that stuck with us. This is where magic systems come in. And although science, history, and magic should appear different on the surface, the core concepts of them are the same. The reason people come to enjoy history and science is not because they love the minute details of it, it's because the teacher has found a memorable story to tell and inspired us with it. That's the power of stories. And that's what you should be most concerned about when writing your magic system. Sure, these laws and historical events are indisputable in the world of your own creation, but what if they weren't? Even if we, the authors, have every detail mapped out about our magic systems, that does not necessarily mean we have to convey it to the audience. Magic systems do best not when they list out every detail about their function, but when the writer finds the stories behind those magic systems. It is far more important for the writer to get the reader to imagine what could be done under the rules of their magic system than to explain the rules. When the reader is thinking and theorizing about the magic system and remembering the fundamental principles that you've shown them in their story, then your magic system is well conveyed. But the most important aspect of a magic system is its mystery. The other reason I bring up science and history classes is that these are two topics which do not have all the answers. History is, at best, our best guess, and at worst, our completely wrong guess. We don't actually know what the Romans were like in their day-to-day lives, but we can make a good guess based on what they've left behind, and the culture which has survived. The problem is, though, if you know how quickly our own society has changed within the span of a decade, one can only imagine how quickly a civilization and its people might change within the span of hundreds of years, if not thousands. We tend to think of historical societies as unchanging monoliths, when in reality they are ever ever changing. Every year, we uncover new things which might provide a different context to what we previously thought we knew about our history. Every year, the story of our past changes. But in a lot of ways, it also remains the same. The same is true with science. The way we perceive our world and the way we interact with it and what we come to believe is wholly based on what we observe and study about our world. There are many discoveries we have found which change the context of our reality. For example, did you know that cold doesn't exist? Yeah, like ice and cold is not a real thing. Cold is just the absence of heat. And when you feel cold in the winter, it's not that the cold is entering you, but rather the heat is leaving your body and escaping into the air. If you didn't know that until now, then start thinking about that. One day you'll come to understand that the way you thought about how hot and cold things are has changed completely. That some things make a little bit more sense than they did before. That's what comes with a deepened understanding about science and the world around you. And it's those little things which you should involve in your magic systems. Your magic systems and their rules should be conveyed in such a way that they are both consistent and yet deepening the reader's understanding of it should make the reader come to see your world through an entirely new perspective. The historical events of your world should play a part in this. Depict the actions taken by characters in the history of your world. Leave their motivations as best guesses, so that if you ever do reveal the true historical context of those events, the audience will be all the more satisfied or surprised by those new revelations. The point is, make sure your magic system is flexible. New context added should change both your and your audience's understanding of the world. Take inspiration from things like science and history to really pin down that vibe of discovering something new. Magic systems are at their best when they are consistent and yet have the illusion of being ever-changing and evolving. Your magic system should not change too much, but the perception you and your audience has of it should. I've seen many a series which fails to do this, and I've seen many which do a good amount, but not quite enough. I've seen magic systems which are more science than magic, and I really think that's a shame. Even if we are taking inspiration from things like science, I think magic should still be its own separate thing. When something is explored in such a detailed way that there is seemingly no discovery or mystery about magic and how it works, I feel those systems lose their appeal. Star Wars tried to do this a little while ago, talking about midichlorians and other things which explained the Force and how it functioned. The Force, in its original concept, was just that, the Force. A mysterious force for which some people were sensitive to and could manipulate to gain magical abilities. In a seemingly sci-fi world, the Force was a notably magical and inexplainable phenomena which was only understood so far as it could be utilized by the Jedi and Sith. The audience knows what we can do with the Force, but we do not know why it exists in the first place or why only certain people had access to it. And when the prequels explained this esoteric magic system as a microscopic creature that empowers people, the Force kinda just loses its appeal. No longer is the Force something which science and technology cannot fully describe. No longer is the Force something which transcends the laws of reality. No longer is it a mysterious force which empowers only a select group of people. No, now it's the result of bacteria in some people, giving them psychic powers or whatever. I'm sure they've retconned this or walked this explanation back, but that only proves my point further. Explaining your magic system down to its roots makes it lose its appeal. No one needs a scientifically grounded explanation for why some people can use magic and others cannot. Magic should transcend that sort of thing. Its origins should exist outside of definitive explanations. Instead, magic systems should be explained to your audience through theory and best guesses, through personal introspective meditations on the magical powers a character possesses, and the overarching purposes of magic in the world. Show what characters can do with their magic, show how they can progress their magical abilities, but also show the questions they ponder about along the way. Pose those questions openly to the audience and allow them to be pondered, but do not answer them. The difference between history, science, and your magic system is that if you say a magic system works in one way, then that is the definitive truth, and it will always be the truth until you say otherwise. Meanwhile, science and history only changes because our perspectives and knowledge of those topics change. The truth always remains, but our perception of it changes. Because some things are impossible to answer, but the speculation and best guesses are what intrigue us most of all. That is what you should take inspiration from. Do not make magic into science. Make magic into something that can never have a full answer. Make your magic system something that can be argued about or speculated on, not just by the characters in your story, but the audience of your story. Something which can have a lot of answers that all feel correct in one way or another. Something which will always set our minds ablaze with what things could be. A good magic system is not about how many rules it has or how detailed those rules are. It's about what you convey and why you convey it. It's about what that magic system can tell the reader about your world. Magic can be the central piece of your story, or it can be that which fills the story with wonder. While I have seen many stories get this right, I don't think there has ever been a story in my recent memory which has gotten it quite right like Frieren has. If you have not watched Frieren, I highly recommend it. In fact, even if you are not a fan of anime, Frieren is a story you should simply not miss out on. If not for the story and characters itself, but the beautiful animation, world building, and incredible music. But most of all, I would look to Frieren as an example of what a magic system should be in your story. During the story of Frieren, our main character's hobby is basically to collect different magical spells, whether it's something as grand as shooting a massive laser beam, or as simple as cleaning the rust off a statue or the mold off of an iron pot. There are small moments in Frieren which teach you about how its magic system works, but it never goes out of its way to fully explain it in the way that most anime tend to do. Those who can cast magic simply can because they have the aptitude for it, and the training to do so. Spells are crafted over years of careful study and practice. Long-lived races such as demons and elves will spend centuries making a single spell. In fact, Frieren is the perfect example of finding a story to tell the viewer instead of dumping exposition about how your magic system works. During the first few episodes of Frieren, we learn about a demon lord who had run rampant through the human villages before being stopped by Frieren's old party. We are told that the party, at the time, could not kill this demon lord because he was simply too powerful for them to defeat at the time. So instead, he was sealed away for the past 80 years. Frieren, during this episode, tells her protege to read up on the history of this demon lord, but her protege puts it off. We also see scenes of Frieren launching magic at her, teaching her about defensive magic and how best to utilize her mana so as not to run out at the wrong time. In this time, Frieren has managed to tell us a compelling story, as well as establish a few rules about how magic works. We know that there's a limited supply of mana, which is fairly standard as far as fantasy goes. We also know that magic can be molded, and that defensive magic costs a lot to maintain. Therefore, it is important for mages to manipulate mana to protect only areas which are most vulnerable to attack. We also know that magic and magical spells are used for all sorts of things beyond just slinging fireballs at each other. They can be incredibly mundane things, stuff which could be accomplished with normal tools and a little bit of elbow grease, but which a spellcaster can do easier if they know the principle behind it. We know that people create these spells to help themselves with their daily lives, and that every spell has a reason for its existence. At first, the viewer might not see the connection between the defensive magic and this demon general. But by the end of the episode, we will come to know why Frieren chose to teach her student this lesson, as well as why she urged her to read that book in the first place. You see, this demon general, who had once been too powerful to defeat, was no longer anywhere near the threat he once was when the seal was released by Frieren. Not because he was weakened by being sealed or because Frieren had prepared for decades to ensure this demon general would not hurt anyone when he got free. No, He was weaker because his magic was no longer as dangerous as it once was. In his time, perhaps he was the first to craft a sword of iron, but as time passed, humans found how to create shields and armor made with steel. Because unlike many fantasy worlds, the relatively short lifespans of humans are not treated as a weakness, but instead their greatest strength. What was once a demon's accursed killing magic honed over centuries was soon countered by human mages after a mere 80 years of study. Because humans know how limited their time is, and therefore do not waste a single day of it. 80 years is nothing to elves and demons, but to humans it is an entire lifetime of experience and knowledge. Human beings in Frieren are not powerful because of their numbers or some arbitrary innocuous humanity, but because of how quickly they can evolve magic and how fast they can learn things. The demon general was no longer a threat because the humans had found a way to counter his magic and use it for themselves. What was once an unbeatable spell is now nothing more than basic attack magic to modern mages. And in later episodes, we come to learn that not only was this demon general's magic completely countered, it was also changed to be used against demonkind themselves. And in that entire explanation, not once do we hear about how it's possible to change magic like that, or some sort of arbitrary magical classifications, or even how mana enters and exits the body. Magic just happens, and it makes sense for it to just happen. The magic in Frieren can make wondrous meadows bloom with flowers, but only if Frieren understands and has seen those flowers before. It can lift shipwrecks, but there is a limit to how much can be done in a single day. Not because those are the limitations of magic itself, but likely because no one has found a more effective way to do it with magic. You would not have thought a mage as powerful and long-living as Frieren would know every single spell there is to know, but when you really think about it, Freiren's journey to find new magical spells, big and small, will never end so long as humans exist, because humans are always finding new ways to make magic. I have not read the manga for Frieren, and at the moment of writing this, the show has not finished airing, nor am I fully caught up on every episode. However, I think Frieren collects the false grimoires of her old master not because they are books of powerful magic, but because they are books with new magic, books which produce the same spell with a different method, an endless adventure which takes her to numerous places and helps her meet numerous people. I cannot gush enough about Frieren and how good it is, especially as someone who very much enjoys high fantasy settings as well as magic systems in general, but I think I've made my point here, so I'll move on. The simple fact about magic systems and why you might suck at writing them is because you're too preoccupied with giving definitive answers about your magic system, and not instead focusing on what you should be doing as a writer, which is providing your readers with a compelling story to follow, which happens to teach them about your magic system along the way. Exposition is sometimes necessary, but info dumps are not. Find ways you can organically show the functions of your magic systems, so that people can intuitively understand and remember the rules you establish. And if something is going to run in conflict with those pre-established rules, either find a way to ensure consistency or show why magic has changed in the first place. With Frieren, humans are always changing magic, for example, and therefore the principles are flexible and hard to fully distinguish. Another reason you might suck at writing magic systems is because you're too busy using magic as either a plot device or a crutch. If your protagonists are constantly discovering new revelations on the spot about their magic systems, or getting handed new abilities which don't make any sense with pre-established lore or stories, then your magic system sucks. I don't remember where I learned this rule in storytelling, but I think it's relevant here. Basically, when you're writing conflict, it's okay for the villains to get power-ups and for misfortune to happen to the heroes. It's compelling to watch the protagonists adapt to worsening conditions. However, giving heroes unearned powers or having them be lucky is just cheating. There is no such thing as luck in fiction, because the fate of your heroes is always under your direct control as a writer. The same is true with your magic system. If your magic system only ever serves to deus ex machina the protagonist, then it's a poorly utilized magic system. Magic should not evolve when it rescues the protagonists from a situation. If your main character is constantly discovering random new abilities in the heat of the moment due to luck, or being the chosen one, then it can get a bit stale. Obviously, you can afford to do this a little bit, but like I said before, it's a crutch, and you shouldn't rely on it all the time. If you want your character to discover a new aspect of your magic system in the midst of a battle, then why not build up to it? Why not pose the relevant questions both to the characters as well as to the viewer? Show your character's training, show the audience what they currently lack. Then, in the heat of the moment, remind your viewers of those unanswered questions as you break it through to a new revelation. Power-ups in your magic system and in general should not be safety nets to get out of a corner you've written yourself into. They should be written with intent and planned ahead of time. They should reveal something new about the magic system of your world and answer a question which either lingers in the viewer's mind or is posed during the story. And don't just reserve those revelations for protagonists either. Imagine a scene where the protagonists are doing well against the villain, only for the villain to undergo a revelation of their own. The heroes may have to run, or perhaps the fight ends a lot closer than it initially would have. Of course, don't overdo this either. Oftentimes, writers will put their characters in an unwinnable scenario, which requires them to utilize plot armor in order to move the story forward. Speaking of moving forward, let's talk about logistics for a moment. Getting something from point A to point B. How do we do that? Well, in the modern era, we have a great deal of ways to do that. Whether it's semi-trucks on the roads, large cargo ships, trains, or cargo planes. All of these inventions came with a progression of technology and a deepened understanding about the laws of reality. It also came about because the needs of people were not always served with what was currently around them. Trade is necessary for any burgeoning society, and so every society should have an interest in things going from point A to point B as fast and efficiently as possible. Now let's imagine for a second that your magic system has the ability to make someone teleport. What does this mean for the logistics of your world? Well, most writers are going to do their best to avoid this question, either by making teleportation magic incredibly rare or by simply having it not affect their world at all. And that's fine. Sometimes we wish to maintain a certain level of technology and tone to our stories, so we do not delve into detail about the effects of our magic system on the world. However, the truly great magic systems do. And in fact, if a society knew how to make people teleport, it would only be rare for a moment before humans did what humans do best, and innovate. There is an incredible tactical and economic advantage to something like teleportation magic. So it's only natural every country in your world would want to perfect it first. Now, I'm not saying you should do this and modernize your magical world. In fact, I would personally hate it if you did that. Instead, what I'm trying to do is get you to consider how your magic system might affect your world, and how people might adapt to living in those conditions. Don't run from it by telling the viewer magic is simply too rare to affect the world in any meaningful capacity. Instead, go down the rabbit hole of what it means to have a certain spell exist. Think of the other uses things like teleportation, gravity, or prestidigitation can have. Another example of thinking about how your magic system affects your world is something like the ethics of enchantment magic versus necromantic magic. In a medieval society, is there a use for serfs if one can just utilize magic to craft undead skeletons which tend to the fields instead? Undead which do not need food or water and do not tire during the summer and do not have minds of their own nor a soul, and therefore provide free and ethical labor to whichever country utilizes them? Sure, there may be some who are still morally opposed to necromantic thralls, but is it really more ethical to enslave or indenture a free-willed human being? And what about things like enchantment magic? Spells which can manipulate the mind, spells which can force you to believe things which are not true, spells which can psychologically destroy and lobotomize. Isn't that magic school more deserving of the public ire? isn't it more unethical? The reason your magic system might suck is because you're borrowing too much from what has come before. Instead of pondering questions like this, you've likely just defaulted to making necromancy bad in your world, while ignoring the ethical implications of enchantment magic. Pondering these questions and taking them to their logical conclusions can help you create a magic system which feels completely unique to your own world. Everything you write about your world should have some sort of impact on the setting. And even though it is a lot of work to do something like that, I would argue it's worth it. Tolkien is the most classic example of something like this. He took inspiration from classical myths and legends, as well as historical events to craft his world. A world, mind you, which changed fantasy novels forever. Tolkien created a world and a magic system so compelling that many writers will borrow heavily from that groundwork for their own stories. I am no different. There is a level of expectation when it comes to having magic systems and magical races. Dwarves are underground dwellers who are highly intelligent and craft wondrous machines. Elves are noble, long-living archers with a posh attitude. Orcs are evil, brutish warmongers who seek only to eat and destroy. Your magic system is not just about the spells which can be casted, but also the world it contextualizes. How does it affect the people who live in your world? How does it shape their culture and their way of thinking? Sure, we can take real-world inspiration for cultures of our magical world, but the simple fact is, when magic exists, then it simply is not our world anymore. If your magic system is a large part of your world, then consider how the different cultures and countries view it. Is it something that many revile and shy away from? Or is it something which they use to gain competitive advantages? Is magic distinguished into multiple schools, and if so, why are they separated in that way? And above all, even if you as the author are asking and answering these questions, they do not need to be presented to the audience you're writing for. However, to bring it back to the beginning of this video, you should have a list of hard rules for your magic system. And you might be thinking, well, magic is free and esoteric and unknowable. And you're right, but that should only be true for the viewer. Because if there are no rules for you as the writer, then your magic system becomes an amalgamous sludge of it does whatever I feel like it should. And even if your goal is to create a chaotic or reality-bending magic system, then it should still adhere to its own unique logic. Here's an example of how a writer will create rules for themselves for which the audience does not fully understand, and therefore perceives as utter chaos. How do you think the writers of Looney Tunes created Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner? On the surface, we see their antics as completely nonsensical. The Roadrunner can seemingly go inside of painted walls, defy gravity, and just physics in general. Wile E. Coyote can seemingly survive any explosion and is always fending off starvation. Gravity only ever appears to affect them when they realize that they should be falling. And no matter how many times they fall off a cliff, it's never enough to kill them, even if it seems to be their greatest weakness. Now, that all seems like it defies logic, but really, it only defies our own logic. After all, the Looney Tunes, including Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, were all created with a list of rules which could not be broken during their animations. What I've previously described is not only a list of observations, but completely in line with the actual rules the writers of Looney Tunes adhered to behind the scenes. On the screen now is an example. Rule number 1, the Roadrunner cannot harm the coyote except by going meep meep. Rule number 2, no outside force can harm the coyote, only his own ineptitude or the failure of Acme products. Trains and trucks were the exception from time to time. Rule number 3, the coyote could stop anytime if he were not a fanatic. Rule number 4, no dialogue ever except meep meep and yowling in pain. Rule number 5, the Roadrunner must stay on the road, for no other reason than they are a Roadrunner. Rule number 6, all action must be confined to the natural environment of the two characters, the Southwest American desert. Rule number 7, all tools, weapons, or mechanical conveniences must be obtained from the Acme Corporation. Rule number 8, so on and so forth. And if you look over these rules while remembering the classic shorts between these two characters, you will find that it is always consistent with these rules. And yet, as viewers, we never would have known there were any rules to begin with. Instead, we only experienced the loony in Looney Tunes. And I believe your magic system should be written in the same way. Not once does Looney Tunes ever reveal through exposition what the rules for their characters are. Instead, they show it, and through observation we can see that there is a consistent set of logic even if the events themselves are completely nonsensical and chaotic. Allow your magic system to speak for itself, but ensure that you have a set of rules to follow when you're writing about your magic system. Many people tend to think that rules and laws are limiting to one's creativity. However, that could not be further from the truth. It is precisely because of these rules and limitations that we are able to narrow our focus and be more creative, finding loopholes in our own rules and logical statements, being clever about how we go about following these rules. Leaving every option available to yourself as a writer ironically leaves you with less creative solutions to problems you're writing about. If your magic system can just poof everything you need into the world, then why does anyone struggle for anything in your story? It is the set of limitations we put upon ourselves as writers which incentivize us to consider options we never would have if we were not under those limitations. It allows us to find something new, and in some cases, something far better than our initial solution. Writing rules and keeping them hidden from the audience, but still adhering to those rules is the best way to make a magic system in my opinion. And I highly recommend anyone watching this try it the next time you need to come up with a magic system for your world. But we will forever be bound by our mundane reality unless we learn how to create something from nothing. So put thought to action, words to a page, and start writing.